Hey everybody, it's Ed. Happy New Year. I've got two quick announcements. First, and most importantly, I want to thank two brand new podcast supporters, Reagan Neese and Sebastian Sokanos. Both Reagan and Sebastian signed up to support the podcast via Patreon, so you can go to mountainandprairie.com/support if you want to learn more about those options. Second, every other month I send out an email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. I started this list about 4 years ago by sending it out to about 30 people I knew, and the list has just grown and grown and grown. It's crazy. But I'll be sending out my latest email on December 31st. So if you want to sign up, go to mountainandprairie.com/reading or just follow the link in the episode notes. If you sign up after the 31st, once you do, you get a confirmation email, and it'll have links to every single book that I've recommended over the past 4 years. So sign up if you feel like it. And it probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I don't send out any spam, any sales pitches, or any other typical internet funny business. It's just one email every other month full of good books, and I think you'll enjoy it. That's it for now. Hope 2020 gets off to a great start. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Peter Heller. Peter is a renowned novelist, as well as an award-winning adventure writer and former contributing editor to Outside, Men's Journal, and National Geographic Adventure. Since age 11, Peter has been committed to the craft of writing, and his lifelong love of words and stunning prose are the threads that connect all of his work, from fiction to nonfiction to poetry. His most recent novel, The River, is the culmination of Peter's decades of storytelling. The book weaves a masterful tale that combines adventure, deep friendships, wild places, chilling violence, and page-turning suspense. For those of you who subscribe to my bi-monthly book recommendations email, you may remember that I devoured this book in less than 2 days and absolutely loved it. Peter was born, raised, and educated on the East Coast, but headed west soon after college to paddle rivers and immerse himself in the wide-open spaces of the American West. His writing career has taken him to some of the most far-flung corners of the earth. Still, he always returns to the Rockies, where he currently splits his time between Denver and Paonia, a rural community on Colorado's western slope. The characters and landscapes of the West play prominent roles in all of Peter's novels, and his talent for capturing the beauty and complexity of people and wild places is second to none. We met up at Peter's home in Denver and had a fun, wide-ranging conversation, covering everything from his early obsession with writing to his current writing process to our mutual love of surfing. We talk about his first big paddling trip to Colorado, which started his decades-long love affair with the West. We then talk about his early days as a professional writer, discussing everything from how he made it work financially to how he dealt with rejection. We dig into the specifics of his daily writing routine and why he stops writing at 1,000 words even if he's mid-scene. We also talk about how he avoids thinking when writing novels, his obsession with finding the flow in both writing and outdoor pursuits, the importance of momentum, and balancing physical exuberance with his writer's life. If you enjoy Peter's books, the West, or learning about writers, you'll love this episode. And as a special bonus, I'm giving away a copy of Peter's new book, The River, via Instagram. So head over to my Instagram page, give me a follow, and be on the lookout for the giveaway. You can either search by my name, Ed Robertson, or follow the link in the podcast episode notes. The River was one of the best books I read in 2019, so I know you'll enjoy it too. Thanks again to Peter for being so generous with his time and so insightful with all of his answers. Be sure to check the episode notes for links to everything we discuss, including an image of the Winslow Homer painting that we mention about halfway through the conversation. Hope you enjoy. Maybe the easiest way to ease into it is just at the beginning. You are not a native Westerner, but you grew up kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Brooklyn Heights.
Yep.
And I went to a little school just up the street called St. Anne's.
Uh-huh.
And I guess it was for quote-unquote gifted kids. So I was surprised they made a mistake. Their one mistake. And but it was a great school. The teachers were some of the best I've ever had. Even after college and everything, they remain some of my favorites. And I grew up loving to write. My dad would read to me every night before I went to sleep.
Yeah.
And luckily at this school in Brooklyn, they had this cool library and this wonderful librarian named Annie Bosworth who sort of guided our reading. And so it's actually a great place to grow up for a writer.
And so I've read when I was reading articles about you and listening to interviews, so there were several different sources that where you mentioned at 11 years old something clicked in you and you said, I wanted to be a writer. And was there something unique about 11?
Well, it's a great time. You're so open to the world. And
Sure.
I was a voracious reader, and I was, my dad was reading poetry to me, every night before I went to bed. He had me reading like E.E. Cummings when I was 6,
Oh, wow.
Which is sort of grounds for social services. When you think about it, they're so raunchy. Uh-huh. But I didn't understand them. But I liked the music and the language, and I wanted to be a poet. And then when I was 11, I was walking around that little library, and I had a crush on Annie Bosworth.
Mm-hmm.
She was English, and I would have married her just for the way she said my name. She said, Pita, are you looking for something to read? And I was like, uh-huh.
What did I hear you? Can you say that again?
And she said, well, come over here. And, a great librarian, like a great bookseller who's been following your reading since, you were tiny, knows what you're ready for. And she brought me over to the fiction shelf and pulled down this slim little volume of short stories called In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway. And they're mostly Nick Adams stories up in northern Michigan. And I took that home, and, you got to picture an 11-year-old kid in New York City opening these Nick Adams stories. I mean, my heart just kind of leapt out of my chest. I was like, I want to do that. I want to, hop off a freight train in the upper Michigan Peninsula and carry a rucksack through grass that wet my pant legs with dew. And I want to camp by the Big Two-Hearted River and make cowboy coffee and not burn my tongue, the way Nick didn't burn his tongue, and fish for those gorgeous trout.
Yeah.
Really, I'd never fished for trout before, but I knew I wanted to do it. Uh-huh. And then, like in the end of something, that beautiful breakup story, I wanted to have a girlfriend that could row and fish like a man,
Yeah.
And I thought that, and then break up with her because, Nick did.
Uh-huh.
I don't know why. She was awesome. But mostly what I wanted was to write like this guy. I mean, the writing, maybe for the first time I had that experience where you read prose that's so compelling and beautiful and moving that it doesn't go through your head. It kind of goes through your skin, directly to your heart. I had that experience, and I was like, I want to do that. And so, that kind of started this discipline in a way. I mean, I really took it seriously. I would read the dictionary and make lists of words I didn't know.
Yeah. Well, I saw somewhere you said at that point I'd started doing things that writers do so I could be a writer. I mean, what the dictionary, were there other kind of disciplines you took up?
Yeah, I read that Jack London used to put words up on the wall that he didn't know on cards. I did that. I read somewhere that other great writers would copy out, whole short stories poems that they loved, and I did that. I didn't copy out whole stories, but I did paragraphs, and just to get the rhythm of this writing of these people that I loved, I read voraciously and practice. I wrote poetry, I wrote short stories, and it's all I really wanted to do except be outside. I mean, it's interesting because I was a physically exuberant kid, so on the one hand I would read the dictionary and read Faulkner at home by myself. But on the other hand, I was gregarious. I had a pack of friends. I loved being outdoors, which was tough in Brooklyn.
Yeah, sure.
And that's a tension that's remained, through my writing life.
So your folks, everything I've seen that you've said about them is just they were unbelievably supportive of your work and of this path you've taken, which, I mean, it's a tough path, no matter what, any creative path, but it's not like going and getting a very safe job somewhere at some corporation. And so were your parents, what did they do? What was their background?
Yeah. So, my dad was a copywriter. That's what he did for his job. And
cool.
he was a madman. I mean, he was on Madison Avenue, vice president of a big ad agency, on the writing side. Yeah. And he wore those suits and went to, he said he used to go to 5 martini lunches. Not a lot of work got done in the afternoon, but he would write comedy plays in the afternoon. He was so brilliant that, my dad would get like a campaign assignment, to come up with something for like Seagram 7 or, Scrabble or whatever, Timex. And he'd have a week. So in the shower, the next morning, he would come up with this like brilliant slogan, whatever it was, and have this whole campaign in his head. And then he'd spend the rest of the week coming up with, no one would believe it was any good if he came up with it that fast. So he'd like get a couple of worse ones, So in the meeting, he could show those and then say, now look at this. Yeah. But the rest of the week, he would just write plays. He was a real writer, and he read and read and read. He was extremely erudite. And so he would help me, when I was at home writing stories, he would come out, look over my shoulder and say, now look, not so many long sentences in a row. Let's, get a little rhythm. Let's balance the long sentences and the short sentences, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then my mom was, she was a private eye and also an incredible artist. And she was sort of she would make art out of bones and found objects. And a lot of it was very kind of dark. Like she made voodoo altars and stuff out of human skulls. And once a window washer came into her studio and he saw all these voodoo altars and stuff. And the next day he came back with a skull in a bucket, human skull. Oh, yeah. And he said, Mrs. Hella, don't ask. And so she covered it with gold leaf and put it on this pedestal and ornamented it. It sat there, until a few years ago.
And a lot of Celine came from her, correct?
Yeah. She is as written. I mean, I just wrote the book about my mom, all the family history and everything. But anyway, so she was an artist. And she was such a great mother to have for a writer because, when I started, I had to make a living. So I started writing for magazines. And, I'd say, Mom, I've got a cover story for Outside, and she's the type of mother that would say, and how's the poetry going?
That's cool.
Which was really cool.
That is
cool. So those guys encouraged me that way. But I have to say, this thing about writing being a tough road, and I think my wife is an actor, and it's tough, and I have other friends that are painters, and it's tough. But for me, I was so sort of romantic. I grew up reading On the Road. I grew up reading, all those Nick Adams stories. And frankly, I spent years like living out of the back of my truck with an old Remington typewriter in the back and a fishing rod and a kayak on the roof. And I couldn't think of anything happier making than just driving around in my truck, sleeping in the back, teaching kayaking at NOC down in North Carolina,
sure, yeah.
In the mountains, putting a chair or stool out on my tailgate with the typewriter. I mean, I just thought, what could be better than this? If I'm making, Jack, big whoop, I'm the happiest guy in the world. And I was writing poems. I was writing short stories. I didn't need a house or, any of that, a fancy car. And so I don't know. There's something about, and being an outdoorsman, I didn't mind, camping. I could have just camped all year. Who cares?
Sure. That's really cool. So when you were a kid, did you travel out west much? Did y'all do family vacations out this way?
No, I grew up in the summer, so I would go to the Adirondacks, for like 7 weeks in the summer. There was this cool camp I would go to where I learned to canoe and climb and all that. And then I would come back and spend like a few weeks at Fisher's Island off the, in the Long Island Sound, which was, sort of DuPonts and Whitney's and my grandmother, which was a weird contrast. But I liked it because there was waves, and rocks, and I'd go spearfishing, and
That's cool.
I'd go body surfing, and I didn't care about the country club, So I was always like that, I just wanted to be out with the birds and the fish and the animal, the bear. And
so what drew you out this way after you went to college Northeast? And then when did you end up here? Well,
I went to Dartmouth, and two of my really good friends, one was from the mountains of Colorado. He was a ski jumper and a great kayaker, and another was his name's Landis Arnold, and he was in Sarajevo ski jumping. Wow. But his family was up in Tabernash, which is up by Winter Park. And his dad was the doctor at the he was a 10th Mountain Division guy, and he was the doctor at Winter Park ski area, so a real mountain doctor. So Landis came from this sort of real mountain background, and he was a really good kayaker. And this other guy, Sasha Steinway, who lives right down the street, was a great big water kayaker, and they both encouraged me to get in a boat and try it, and I did. And then that first summer, I think my sophomore summer, they said, "Hey, we're going out to Colorado, and we're gonna paddle. You better come." And so they dragged me out here, and it was like a high water year, 1980, I think. They dragged me out over to the Arkansas Valley. Put me on the numbers, which are class 4, which are class 5 at big water, and it was big water. And I just swam every day. And my head, I would try to roll. It would take me 7 attempts to roll the kayak, and my head would be hitting the bottom. And, but I hung in there and learned to paddle with these guys. And I fell so in love with it. I mean, I grew up, when I learned to kayak, I was learning in New Hampshire, where, the high water is early April, and there's ice and water and snow on the bank, and the water's freezing, and it might be raining. And I was out here, and it was like 90-degree heat. Your stuff would dry in 5 minutes. It was big water. There were like herds of elk. There were snow-capped mountains. I just couldn't believe it. I was like pinching myself. I was like, really? And there was no way I was not going to come back here after school. And so here I am.
That was my first taste of the West. In high school, they sent me to Buena Vista for some kind of leadership retreat.
Come on.
Yeah, and that was my first taste. And that place always holds a special place in my heart. And it wasn't hardcore. We were doing, typical like a rafting trip and some rock climbing. But that place has always been super special just because it was my first taste.
Yep, and that's, for the listeners, that's the same valley. I mean, that's where the numbers are, right by Buena Vista. And it's beautiful. That's
really cool. And so you get out of college and decide you're going to make a go of it as a writer. What did that look like?
Well, I went to L.A. first.
Okay.
My best friend from high school is Carlton Cuse, and he was the showrunner and producer of Lost.
Oh, okay.
And he's the creator and showrunner for Jack Ryan, the big show on Amazon now. And he's done, excuse me, he got a bunch of shows. I always say, just for fun, he didn't seem that smart in high school. Go figure. But he really was. And he was, after he went to a different college than I did. And when he got out, he went to L.A. He graduated a year earlier, and he went out to L.A. and worked for a producer and said, "Hey, Pete, come out here. Let's write a screenplay, and let's get our start in L.A." And I went out for a year, and we wrote a screenplay, and it was fun, and it turned into some fun. But I hated L.A.
What about it? Just the congestion?
God, it was just no community, you know. And by then, I had a taste of Colorado. I really liked being in the mountains. I wasn't a surfer yet. If I'd have been a surfer, I probably would have lived, on the beach somewhere, and that would have been fine. But and it was, I thought it was a lonely place. It was so fractured in so many ways. I think it's better now. The only thing I liked about it is I lived in Beechwood Canyon, and I would run up the canyon and every afternoon into all the brush, and there were red tails up there and coyotes under the Hollywood sign,
Yeah.
And I'd run those trails, and I liked that, but I hated LA. So after a year of that, I went and worked in North Carolina for a year at the Nottahale Outdoor Center, teaching kayaking and working in a paddle shop, and loved that too. And then Landis called and said, "Hey, I'm living in Boulder. I got a house. I got a cheap room to rent. Why don't you come out here and we'll kayak and you can get a job." And so I got a job delivering pizza.
Nice, that works.
And teaching kayaking and other stuff too. But, you do everything you can to support yourself. But I was spending a lot of my day writing poems, trying to write stories for Esquire, and I even got rejected. I think I got a rejection from Guns and Ammo.
Really?
Or hunting. I think I wrote a piece about Landis and I went up and got our first elk up by Devil's Thumb up here, and I wrote a story about that, and they rejected it. They said, "Where's your pictures?"
Does that rejection? You seem so happy-go-lucky and just you're obviously very focused, but upbeat and optimistic. Did that rejection ever get to you after a while, or were you enjoying the process so much it was kind of like?
I didn't expect. I had an English teacher in high school who said, he was trying to be a writer, and he said, "I have a whole shoebox full of rejections." Mm-hmm. And I sort of treasure them because they just remind me to, just keep at it. And, I always thought that was good. That was good. And the other thing was, my girlfriend at the time, Lisa Jones, who's still one of my best friends, she lives up by Boulder. And I think I was 20. I forget how old I was. I was 26 or something. And she gave me a galvanized trash can for my birthday. And she said, "Fill it up." And this was sort of back when you still had hard copies and stuff. And you could crumple it up
throw it in there,
make a 2-pointer or a 3-pointer. But I always thought, I just knew it was going to be a tough road. I mean, everything I'd, read and heard about the biographies of writers, I just knew it was tough. Everybody but Keats, who died at 26
exactly.
and, was the greatest poet ever.
Go out on top.
So I knew it was going to be hard. I tried Esquire. I remember sent them a couple of things, and I got really nice notes back. I thought that was cool at 24 to get a note from an editor at Esquire. Even the New Yorker, I sent them a short story, and I remember Charles McGrath wrote me a whole page note,
cool.
saying, you really got something, keep at it, and so I did.
That's really cool. And so, what was the first story that you put in and got published, and you were like, "All right"?
Okay. So I was like 28. I was back. This girlfriend, Lisa, was working as a reporter in the Upper Valley between New Hampshire and Vermont.
Okay.
And I got a job back at Dartmouth College, where I had gone to college, at the Canoe Club. They have a really established, 100-year-old, just a great sort of nursery for great paddlers and expeditioners. And I got a job running the Canoe Club for a year, which was so neat. And so I would, I'd write during the day, and then in the afternoon, when the kids were done with their classes, I would go teach these kids to kayak and take them on, river trips. And I got that like a cadre of it was really neat. I was very proud of it. I got 12 students who had never been in a kayak. And in 1 year, I had them confidently running class 4.
Wow. And,
we was rigorous. And I loved it. I loved it. But during that time, I sat down, and in about 2 hours, I wrote a little short story that was very lyrical. And I sent it cold. I just folded it up into an envelope. Believe it or not, put a real stamp on it. And put it in the mailbox. And 11 days later, the fiction editor from Harper's called, said, "We want to publish this."
Nice.
So that was my first thing. And that was a calling card then when I realized I wanted to start writing for magazines.
So I've read, and what you just said now, and then I've read that sometimes your writing can just come out of you. You'll just sit down and I read somewhere that when you wrote, I guess it was Dog Stars, it said it came out in a white heat. You just cranked it out. And it seemed, and then I've heard you talk about how you, especially with your fiction, you don't think. You just, if you can get in the zone and not think. So can you talk about that process of just kind of letting it rip versus being inside your head, trying to figure it all out ahead of time?
Well, it's interesting. I got diverted for like 20 years, writing for magazines. And it was the coolest sort of, it was a wonderful diversion, so joyful because, like I said, I'm physically exuberant. I love to go on expeditions. I got to be sent all over the world, kayaking, in the Pamirs and, South America and the Caucasus and, in the Himalayas. And sort of like about 2010, 2011, I've been doing it for 25 years or more. And I just thought, it's time. I had followed one editor from magazine to magazine, Outside to Men's Journal, National Geographic Adventure to Business Week, and they were paying me $3 a word, which at that time I thought was like amazing. Mm-hmm. I had money saved up, and I thought, I could sit down for like 9 months, I think, without taking a story and write the novel that I've always wanted to write since I walked around that library with Annie Bosworth and read it in our time. And so I went to the coffee shop and I sat down. And I thought, I don't want to outline or plot because all my nonfiction that I've been writing for the past 2 decades, I always knew what was going to happen next because it happened. And I always knew what the ending was going to be.
And would you outline it all for the fiction stories, like structure it out?
I would just.
But you just knew it.
I started in, but I would have to follow. It was usually I was writing about expeditions or, environmental campaigns. And so they had a beginning and an ending. So I would just, it was all laid out for me.
Sure.
And I thought, I don't want to be one of those guys who plots. I'd read John Gardner's book about writing novels, and his sort of idea was to make an outline and just keep filling it in with smaller and smaller A's, B's, and C's and in numbers, and you'd have a novel. And I thought, geez, if I wanted to do that, I could be a lawyer.
Yeah. Engineer.
Right?
Yeah.
But what I realized is that what I loved about paddling and running rivers and, especially in, really wild places is that if you run a river and you've never been on it or it's never been described, you come around a bend, you paddle around a bend in a canyon, and you don't know what's going to have any idea what's going to be there. Could be a waterfall, could be a cougar drinking, could be a backlit flight of, mayflies, hatch of mayflies. I just love that. I love the thrill. And I wanted that. It occurred to me that writing fiction, could be like running rivers. Yeah. That a narrative is like a river. You put on, you follow the narrative current into territory that you've never been in. Mm-hmm. How cool is that?
Very cool.
If you don't think about it and plot it. So I called Carlton, my buddy, and I said, Carlton, hey man, you work with all these novelists making your TV shows and movies. Have you ever met anyone who just sits down and starts with a first line and lets it rip and has no clue? He didn't even hesitate. He said, oh yeah. He said, Pedroni, I work with Stephen King. He often starts with a first line. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, it's like a voice, and the voice is a character. The character's in a place.
Yep.
And there's a situation because there's always a situation, and he writes into the story. And then he said something that really surprised me. He said, I work with Elmore Leonard, and he often start, these tightly plotted, seems like, crime stories in South Florida. And he said, this guy often starts with some character just talking. He's probably in a strip bar because it's Elmer Leonard, in South Miami. But it gave me permission, and I thought, okay, the fiction police are not going to bust down the door if I just start. And I thought, how fun. And I sat down at the table in my coffee shop and I spent a month writing a novel about a 17-year-old girl who could fly at night, like Superman. And I was starting to feel out of my depth. It just didn't have that knock, that hard wood knock of something really true and good. And I realized, I don't have kids. I don't know what 17-year-olds think about. I know one thing they think about because I remember being 17, but it wasn't enough. And I don't really know how to fly, like Superman. And there was just a lot. So I read it to my friend Helen, who's part of this little writers group I'm in here in Denver. And she said, I read like 45 minutes in her kitchen. She said, it's great you're writing fiction, And, your sentences are so good. Mm-hmm. And I knew exactly what that meant. It's like, you got spinach in your teeth, and I'm your friend and I'm going to tell you.
Uh-huh. That's valuable.
It's very good. You got to love these people that stand up for you and take the risk. And so I went back, and the next day, I think, I sat down in my little coffee shop, same one where I had met my wife, years before. And I closed my eyes and I just thought, don't think, just listen. And I wrote, I keep the beast running. I keep the low lead on tap. I foresee attacks. A few lines later, my name is Hig, one name, Big Hig if you need another. If I ever woke up crying in the middle of a dream, and I'm not saying I did, it's because the trout are gone, every one. And as soon as I wrote that and heard that, I just thought, I'm listening, keep talking. And then it was as if this guy was on the other side of a campfire on an October night with the wind blowing the flames around, and he was telling me what had happened to him a few years before. And I would just go in every morning and I would just say to myself, don't think, just listen. Mm-hmm. And it was the most thrilling experience I'd ever had, hands down. And 7 months later, I kept myself to, I have this method where I only write 1,000 words. I don't let myself run on.
Oh, really?
Even when I'm excited.
Not only 1,000, but you will not go more than that?
Yeah, so I'll talk about method now because that's what I did in that first novel. I had read that Graham Greene wrote 500 words every day. Mm-hmm. And he was so assiduous about it that he would keep a subtotal in the margin of his notebook. And at word 500, he'd stop. So it was in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of dialogue in a love scene, and he'd stop. Can you imagine the discipline? And then I realized when I read that, what he was doing was always stopping in the middle. If you set a arbitrary word count and stick to it, you're going to be in the middle of something.
Yes.
So I thought, well, what can I, write with good energy every day? Probably 1,000 words. So I started writing 1,000 words every day. I'd never let myself write less than that. But I would go on after the 1,000 words, and after you do it for a while, when that is. I would let myself go on a little farther until I was in the middle of a scene or something that was exciting me.
And you'd leave it there.
And I'd stop there. So it was, 1,065 words. And my relationship with my writing started to change right away because what I would always do before, and what all my writer friends would do, whatever quota they had for hours or words, if they got excited, they would write through the scene. And if you think about it, and then you go, wow, that was great, and go on with the rest of their day. But if you think about that, that's always a transition. You're always going to be stopping at a double return, white space. And you might as well start the book every morning or evening, and get the rock rolling up the hill. And so doing this method, and that's what I did. And it was so hard to, haul your ass back into the chair, and so doing this, not only was my brain doing all this work on something that, I could have written through. I could have written 3,000 words. I was so excited about the scene. But my mind would do all this work. So when I came back to it, it was probably better than if I'd have written it before. But I had garnered I'd stored up all this pent-up energy. And so I couldn't wait to jump out of bed. I mean, literally, the last few years writing fiction, I go to bed at night and I just why can't it just be daylight and I can make my cup of coffee and get at it, I don't want to lie there for 8 hours.
You ever read Life Work by Donald Hall?
I love Donald Hall, but I never did.
He's talking about his writing, and he said the exact same thing, that he wake up at 3 a.m. and he is so excited, but he forces himself to go back to sleep because he knows it'll wreck his day if he starts at 3 a.m. Yep. But it's the exact same thing.
Yep, that's how I feel. And it's since I started that method, where I'm not facing white space. I'm coming back to something. I stopped in the middle. I've done a lot of unconscious work at night. The way we do, remember when we studied for finals, you know how much work you do at night?
Yep.
When you go to, it's a great method. And if you think about it, if you write 1,000 words a day, and I don't ever, I don't edit as I go. I just
go.
Basically, figuratively let the pen flow, and, if you do that every morning, think about it. If a novel's 100,000 words, in 4 months, you've got a draft. Mm-hmm. and you can kick it into shape.
When you think about the river analogy, the river is there. And so one way or another, you're going to go down it. But when you think about your process of just kind of letting it go, there are all these different environmental factors with the coffee shop you're in, a conversation you had the day before that are influencing your brain one way or another. Do you feel like Dog Stars, for example, could that have gone in a completely could that book's plot could have gone in a completely different direction if environmental factors had been different, or was it going to lay out that way one way or another? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, that's a really existential question. It's like,
because I always wonder about that. I mean, I don't write anything other than, I'll write different things mostly for work, but I always wonder just about the wording and the way I structure things. If I had done this yesterday, would it be completely different? Just because I don't know that my brain would be consistently putting this stuff out, and mine's not creative. So I feel like with creative, it could go in so many directions.
Yeah, maybe it could. But the interesting thing is that, when I'm in the flow and I get in the, when I sit down, I put headphones on with rain, the sound of rain. Mm-hmm. And so I don't hear the friends talking or the real estate deal at the next table or whatever. I put the brim of the hat down so it hits in my view, it hits the top of the laptop, and I'm in this zone, and I get transported, when a few minutes in, I start writing, I get transported, I'm kind of in a flow, and there's a sense of inevitability, it's like, it's interesting, like, I finish, I send it in to an editor. The editor says, well, I think maybe we should move the ending, from here to here. And I go, what do you mean? That's not the way it happened. There's this sense of inevitability about it. Like, when I'm connected to the writing and I'm going along, there's almost a sense that it can't be any other way. That the characters, the weather, the histories of the actors, so it's not that I believe in fate. I don't know what I feel about fate. Mm-hmm. Maybe character is fate, and so I feel like the engines of the characters and the engine of the story it has its own soul and spirit, and it's going to run, and I just get out of the way.
Yeah. So a lot of, I'd say almost, all your fiction, it has so much of parts of your real life. We were talking before we started recording about some of the folks in Paonia that you hang out with and how they make different appearances in the books. And there was one part in The Painter, and I was just curious about this, where, Stegner sees the Winslow Homer painting, and that means so much to him. Does that particular painting have meaning to you? Because I'm obsessed. There's a different Winslow Homer painting that I'm completely
Which
obsessed
one is it?
In the Gulf Stream, or the Gulf Stream. I've got it. Show it to you. But it's similar to the one that you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
I love that.
Man,
I have it.
You can see the squall up in the corner.
Well, you can see the squall, and then you can see the ship off in the distance where he, could possibly save him. I could talk all day about why that picture means so much to him.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if that particular... That's a very selfish question just for me, but if that particular Winslow Homer...
Yeah, of course. I mean, anything I put in the novel, it's crazy. It's almost like the thing, as you go, I feel like I go through my life now and I'm like a baleen whale, just sort of sifting all this krill. And, the stuff that I end up, that ends up impacting me, that strikes me, that has real meaning, it always somehow ends up in the novels. Mm-hmm. I don't mean it to, but it just wings in out of the universe. My first assignment, when I told you I had to make a living, so I started writing for magazines. Because then I was living in town and I had a room and I had to pay rent.
Pesky rent.
Yeah. So I wasn't living out of my truck anymore, but so I started writing for Outside, and my first assignment, a guy died in my arms, on an expedition, And the next 2 days later, we went down to the same river, which had been in flood. The Himalayas were storming, and we could see it, and the river had turned really raucous on this training run, and there had been this awful accident. And this man died in my arms, and it was super, traumatizing.
I can't imagine.
2 days later, we assembled down by the river, and it was now quieted down, and I pulled out a book of poetry that I had, Tang Dynasty Chinese poetry. I thought, my first assignment, I'll bring a book of poems to the to get the spirit of the place. I've done it many times since. Brought a book of poetry, and I read this poem from 760 A.D.
Wow.
Western China.
Wow.
And so 27 years later, I'm finishing the Dog Stars in the coffee shop, and I'm coming to the last page, and Hig, my hero, is out under the stars, and he's making up these constellations. It's a post-apocalyptic story, and he says, and my favorite, and he's missing his dog, and he says, and my favorite poem is by Li Shangyin, written in the 9th century, I guess, he said. And it's called When Will I Be Home? And it was the same poem that I had read for David by the river 27 years before on that expedition. I didn't even know that I knew it, or that I hadn't thought about it, and it winged in out of the ether. And so that's the magic to me of writing fiction, that I don't find in nonfiction, which is the universe just sends in these flights of strange birds, these gifts, and they land on your table, and you can't even believe that they exist. And you put them in the book.
I would think that there are a lot of people that have these thoughts like that, or these ideas come to them, but then they get either self-conscious or they're worried and they think, oh, well, I can't, that won't work, or people might reject that or whatever. And do you think your years of writing in the lead up before you switched over to fiction full time kind of gave you this confidence, like, all right, I know what I'm doing. I can be happy, proud about this. It's like you talked about with your buddy who said, kind of gave you the permission to start with one line. Is that a big part? How does confidence play into it? Because you're putting yourself out there, especially the way you do it.
I think all the magazine work gave me a real sense of craft and a real feeling like I remember in my my first couple of assignments for Outside, I remember my editor saying, could you just sketch this character a little bit, make him come alive, fast, right away. Like, the way, I don't know, Krakauer does it, or somebody like that, who was writing at the time. And I was like, gee, I don't know, let me try, But it gave me something to work on. I was like, okay, how can I, in just a few sentences, evoke this, the spirit of this person? And so I came to writing fiction feeling like, I'm going to go to the hook in the shop. I'm going to put on my apron. I'm going to, sharpen my chisels, and I'm going to go to, and I'm going to make the pieces and the joints, and I'm going to work at it today. And it is sort of a sense of humility. Like, this is a craft. We're not going to sit around and wait to get inspired. And we're also going to trust in the universe that we've written lots and lots of stories, hundreds of stories, and we're going to trust in the universe that it's sort of like, I'll tell you what it's like. This is cool. The best analogy is a horse. When I first got to Colorado and moved to Paonia out on the West Slope, I had read all these Louis L'Amour books, all those, pulp westerns.
Sure. And
all I wanted to do was drift the high country like Telsacket or Hondo. And so I bought a horse, and I borrowed a horse, and I rode to Wyoming.
Yeah, I read that somewhere. I wanted to ask you about that.
And I just had a pack horse, and I brought a friend who, all the ranchers said, we wouldn't do this alone, So at the very last minute, I got a Knowles instructor, a climbing instructor, to ride this Greenbroke mare in the back of the string, And we rode. I had a pack horse, and we rode, for a month up through the mountains. And it was just this beautiful experience. Yeah. I just friggin' loved it. We camped under the same little blue tarp that covered the packs on the pack horse, and I didn't have a stove or anything. We made a fire every night, every morning, and I'd wake up at very first light, and I'd put the horses on hobbles, and they'd graze, and Dandy would come over and by the fire and nudge my shoulder and sniff my coffee. And it was just this beautiful, we'd fish. It was this beautiful trip. But I got lost a few times. And Danny, the guy I was riding, was a 20-year-old outfitting horse. And he'd been hunting in these mountains all his life. And when I got lost, I would just give him his head. I just let the reins loose and he would just find his way back to the trail. And it was amazing. And after 10 hours of riding, if he saw a crossbar in the trees for, dressing deer and a fire pit, he'd just pull in. He'd say, it's time.
This is where we're going to be.
Yeah. So he's a smart guy. And so I think of writing like, it's sort of like you jump up on the horse, and he's a mountain horse, and that's your craft that you've worked at and worked at and worked at and worked at, and you let him run. But every once in a while, because he's a horse and he has a brain the size of a walnut or whatever a horse's brain is, he wants to go down in that gully. And so you just got to nudge him back over, good idea, but maybe not. Let's go this way. And then you give him free rein again. So there's a, little bit, every once in a while you pull back that authorial control because you can feel you're going up a cul-de-sac, you can feel the energy dropping, and so you make this a sort of more deliberate decision, okay, I'm going to just nudge it back over this way. We'll go this way. And then you let it run and just let it run.
Trust it.
Just get out of the way. It's such a thrill. It is like paddling. It is the closest thing I can think of to pulling. You see that horizon line of the rapid, and you see the spray coming up behind it, and hear the roar, and you're like, "Fuck, I'm going over that." And you peel out of the eddy, and you get on the current, and your boat turns, and the current starts to take you, and you sit up, you splash your face, you get your grip on the paddle. And you start, you get the rhythm of the strokes, and you start looking downstream, and it's just that same feeling riding, it's like, okay, the current is taking me, the story's taking me, and I'm gonna go with it, and I'm gonna give it my best. And it's a thrill.
I love the way you described that. One more question about process. I read that when you finished Dog Stars, you pretty much immediately started doing the painter. And have you continued that process of just always going? And what drives that? I mean, obviously you love what you do. That's clear.
Right,
but
right,
is there anything else behind it? I mean, just to
yeah.
keep
Oh,
momentum?
well, yeah. I mean, let's see. My first novel got published when I was like 52 or something. And, I feel like life is short. I'm finally doing what I've wanted to do since I was 11, right? It's like, why slow down? I want to go 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And all cylinders. And so there's that. And I also really believe in momentum, and it's just like, I really treat it like an athletic. I trained, as a kayaker for years, and took it seriously, and learned about having good sleep, and eating well, and getting exercise. So I try and live my life so that I bring the best of myself to those few hours in the morning. When I'm working.
Morning is always the time?
Yeah. I like getting up. I like staying close to my dreams. I like having a couple of cups of coffee and then, getting at it. And so I feel like it really is an athletic endeavor almost. And it feels very physical. You sort of feel after a writing session like it's been a workout. And so I know from, training in the past that, when you stop paddling or running for a week or two, you really feel it when you get back to it.
Definitely.
There's a hitch. You've lost a hit. And so I really believe in that. So, I finish a novel, send it off, take a couple of days, maybe go fishing or whatever, and then come back to it.
Well, it seems like all of your hobbies that I know about, they're all kind of similar to writing in that, there is a process, and there's this kind of ultimate goal of getting in the zone. Fishing, I feel like with fishing, you can really get in the zone. Surfing, obviously. There's no faster way to get in the zone than riding a wave, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, different world. Flying, you fly. And I mean, are you a zone junkie, always trying to get in that zone? Because I am.
I love forgetting that I'm a human being. To me, getting connected, especially, so I love everything I love to do except for the writing where I can transport myself there is outside, and I just love, getting connected to a wild place, whether it's, it's a river mouth in Mexico, that's undeveloped, just the the bay and the river mouth and the Sierra and the turtles popping their heads up and the frigate birds and the boobies and diving and or it's a mountain creek and it's getting late in the evening and the sun's coming down on the ridge and the creek's starting to turn to sort of oil and mercury and you're just casting and waiting and smelling the willows and listening for maybe the knock of an elk and all of that. I forget myself. I just sort of like become absorbed in the place and in the wildness and in all the other beings that are out there. And it's just so, you get so small and it's not even humbling because there's nothing to be humble. Mm-hmm. It's like because you lose yourself, you forget your name, you kind of forget you're a person, you're just in the flow of what you're doing. And you're so connected. And to me, it's like, I don't know how people feel in church, when they feel connected to God, but I know that I feel connected to something much bigger than me. And I love it. I just love it. And that's the feeling I get when I'm in the flow writing.
Have you ever done any mindfulness training, meditation? Do you do anything like that?
I have done some.
Yeah, because it seems like a lot of what you're kind of accomplishing the same thing through these activities.
Yeah.
And it's, in some ways, it's not easier, but, just sitting there trying not to think, that's a hard way to not think.
Yeah, exactly.
Writing away is a lot easier.
Right.
So I want to talk a little briefly about Paonia because I know that's a huge part of your life.
Yeah.
And I love that area. And I haven't spent as much time there as I want to, but like I interviewed Brian Calvert from the High Country News for the podcast. And so I spent some time there. And when I used to be in the real estate business, I'd spend time there. And how did you get there initially? What was
So I had mentioned that I was with this writer, Lisa Jones, and she's now living in Longmont, but we were together and she got a job on the High Country News, which is in Paonia. Yeah. It's an environmental paper of record for the Rocky Mountain West, and she got a job as a staff writer. And we were living in Boulder, and I was kayaking with all my friends here. It was a cadre of really good paddlers, and I was like, I didn't want to go over to some podunk little town in the West Slope. And I drove over one August. I remember I was in my truck. I was hauling a little trailer with my motorcycle on, and I was like coming through the valley, came through Somerset and the coal mines, and I'm like, where is she taking me? And then the valley opened up, and there were the West Elks to the south and the Uncompahgre Plateau kind of stepping out in the desert to the west. And to my right on the north was Grand Mesa, all the woods. And I was like, oh, I get it. And within a few days, the guy who ran the gas station, Bobby Reedy, who's now a dear friend, basically put a fly rod in my hand and said, you go up to this creek and just throw that in there, see what happens. And what happened is that I found, a passion that I followed for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. It's so beautiful there. And it's like a little train set. You know how it is. It's like this little hamlet, in this irrigated valley surrounded by these mountains and mesas and all these vineyards and organic farms. And it's a crazy mix, like a lot of little towns in the West of, coal miners and ranchers and hippies and, quality of lifers with money, and it's this mix. And everybody, because it's a little town, and you kind of have to, everybody sort of gets along. And
the community. I mean, we're built for community, and it's just disappearing in places like that. Yeah, your neighbor might annoy you, but you're in the community, and so you have to deal with it. And that's the way I grew up in my small town, and I think it's invaluable. It's so
it does something to your soul that's really feels like it's feeding it. And I mean, I go down, Bobby Reedy, my buddy, runs the Sinclair station. I mean, he's a car carrying redneck.
Yeah.
And we kind of, he goes, Pete, you know how I am, we don't talk about politics much, mm-hmm. but I'll go in the beer 30 into his, into the office and sit in in the stuffed couch there, the little office chair and chew the fat and just hear, some of the best storytellers ever unwinding these stories about crazy characters in the mountains or hunting or whatever. Mm-hmm. It is awesome, and I love Denver. I don't get that here.
No. Yeah, I think it's being in that close proximity to people. And again, I mean, being able to know somebody for all their good qualities. And then if you disagree on politics, who cares?
Right.
You just don't talk about it.
Right.
Real quick, I want to talk about surfing because that's a love that we both share. And your book, Kook, I lived in Costa Rica for a year and went from never having surfed to getting to where I can stand up and not just about drown over the course of a year. And I just loved that book. So can you just talk briefly about how surfing came into your life and kind of what that means to you now? Because it's a big part.
It's a big part of my life still. I just love it. It's my favorite thing to do, maybe except write and fish too. But so I just come back I'd done the Sangpo Gorge, this maybe the greatest whitewater expedition in history. I was on the ground team covering it for Outside. Deep Gorge in Tibet. It was 37 days through the wildest place on the planet. And, there were tigers, 4 species of leopards. There was like 200 species of rhododendron that had never been described. I mean, this place was wild and it was demanding and people almost died every day, both on the ground and in the river. And I got home and I had lost a ton of weight and I kissed the ground. I was like, I'm alive. And I was sort of sitting here. I wrote the story, and I was sitting right here on the porch. We scraped our old little brick bungalow, and the house you're in now is not the same house. Mm-hmm. But I was looking out here over the lake and watching the snow come across the mountains and thinking, what do I do now? And I didn't know. Do I have to do another big thing? Do I write? What do I do? My friend called and he said, hey, I just had a really rough year. I was transfer from Chicago, being a lawyer, to Huntington Beach. And I want to learn to surf. He's the guy that I grew up kayaking with in college. And he said, let's come over for a week and let's learn to surf. So I was like, all right. So we went, we borrowed boards, and we paddled out at Huntington Beach at the pier. That's not what you do when you're a total beginner. And I remember this guy came up, paddled up to me. He had this long blonde hair. He had a snake tattoo running down into his neck of his wetsuit. And he was really built. He goes, you effing kook, get the F out of the water or I'm going to F you up. I will effing kill your ass. And literally within half an hour, my life was threatened 3 times.
And you didn't completely bail.
No, and I ended up standing up for maybe 1 second.
Yeah.
And third day, we just were so sore. And, we took ibuprofen. We said, let's go up to Seal Beach. Let's try that. So there we are at dawn. The wind's ruffling the palms. And we hear this crunch of gravel. And this beat-up van pulls up. This totally round guy like Santa Claus gets out, stretches a wetsuit over his belly. He's got this straight, long, bleach blonde hair. And it says M&M Surf School on the side of the van. And all these surfers come across the parking lot and hug the guy. He bestows hugs. And we're like, wow, this is a little bit of it. And we hear, I love you too. I love you too. And I'm like, what? After Huntington Beach, or it's like war zone? And who is this guy? Well, he's the saint of Seal Beach. He had fallen off a telephone pole, was the lineman, and he shattered his whole right leg. It had fused. They said he'd never walk again. He taught himself to surf. Mm-hmm. He loved to surf before that. And he said, I got to surf again. So he taught it. And he thought, if I can teach myself, I can teach anyone. So he taught autistic kids. He taught 90-year-old women. He taught and he was such a good teacher that celebrities started coming from LA and investment bankers would fly in from Chicago for a day with this guy. He was like this miracle. But what he did was he established this sort of like extended family around Seal Beach that people just loved, this warm, loving environment. And he was a great teacher, and he would guarantee, you would be up and riding within 15 minutes, on these big foam boards.
Sure.
And he had this special talent for teaching trim, which other surf instructors, they kind of just shove you and say, get up, But he taught the subtleties of trim, which is, scoop forward, skirt back, chest up, chest down, to be right in the right spot on the wave and have the right trim. And I got so crazy that within, 5 days, I bought my own hardboard and I went off on my own, and I'm a water guy, I was a kayaker. I love violent water and getting tumbled. And so this was perfect. And I couldn't even believe it. The first time I actually stood up and trimmed out on a wave and rode the face, I was like, I felt like I'd been hit by a bolt of lightning. You know,
Same.
it was sort of like this thing. I went into the surf shop down at the Huntington Beach, I think S&S surf shop down at the pier. And I was looking for a new board, you know, and the manager came over. I was telling him about trimming out, and he put his arm around me. Here I am. I'm like 46. He put his arm around me. He goes, son, if you were younger, I'd say, there goes college.
That's great.
And it basically did. There went, you know, half the rest of my life, because I was like totally obsessed after that. And so I invited Kim, who you just met, you know, my wife, and we were dating, hadn't known each other very long. I said, hey, I got this old van again. I got a book contract. Let's go down the coast of Mexico. We're apprentice with anybody we can, and see if we can go from getting pushed, you know, on the wave at Seal Beach to riding a big, hollow, fast wave in like 9 months. Let's see if we can do it. And we did.
I clearly remember the first time I rode on the Face. Clearly. Yeah. And I'll never forget it. Ever. And you hear all these kind of hippie talk about surfing. It's spiritual, and it's, you know, but it is. I mean, it is spiritual. It's the idea of riding these waves. It's, you know, kind of the only human scale wave there is. You know, there are waves everywhere. You know,
yeah,
but
right.
We're on this human scale wave and riding it. And it could kill you, but you're riding it. There are a lot of metaphors there.
A lot. And that the wave could come from New Zealand.
Oh, yeah.
It traveled all that way just to give itself to you and lift you up and finishes its life on, you know. I mean, it's amazing. And I love, you know, for fishing, you know, I'm not a very good fisherman, but I love it.
Yeah. Same.
So, you know, I'm wading up the creek, and, you know, all that stuff's going on. And I'm like, you know, I'm the happiest man on the planet. And if I catch a fish too, how cool is that? And I'm like, thank you, fish. And I let it go. You know, we're both like probably relieved. But it's the same way for surfing. You know, I'm out there, you know, we go out just at daybreak, and the sun's just a smudge over the Sierra and the river mouth, and there's, you know, a turtle popping its head up, and maybe a dolphin going by, and all the birds. And I just feel like, and the swell is, you know, lifting your board and lowering your board, and you're looking out for the set. And I just feel like, oh my God, you know, and if I catch a wave and actually ride it, it's like total cream.
Added
you know,
bonus.
it's like,
nah, I'm the same way. That was my whole deal. I was just in Costa Rica, and I mean, I was so out of shape for paddling, and just, you know, it was big, but just being out there was great. I don't even remember how many waves I caught. It was just being there.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing about fishing. And maybe that's just my excuse because I'm not a good fisherman. I'm like, I just like standing in the stream, but I really think I do.
Yeah.
I got a few quick questions that I like to ask people at the end.
Yeah.
Because it's fun to kind of compare.
Yeah.
This would be interesting for you because of how much you read. But if you think about books about the American West, either fiction or nonfiction, are there any that come to mind that are kind of your all-time favorites? That's a hard question.
Blood Meridian.
That's come up a few times.
Yeah. He's amazing. I mean,
Have you ever met him? Yeah, he seems like he's kind of a recluse, but I bet he'd be an interesting guy to talk to.
Maybe not. You know, he might not talk much.
Yeah,
you know,
you're probably right.
I'm always amazed. You know, when I a lot of times when I get interviewed, it's like, you know, I think I'm a writer because I'm not that articulate. I'm a lot more interesting on the page, but I love Cormac McCarthy's work. You know, I think he's sort of a child of Faulkner, and in many ways, and people think of his writing as really spare, but actually he can pile it on, and, you know, and get this rhythm going. And I think he has a real lyrical sense that I just love. You know, I just love the music of his language and sort of the true feel of his descriptions. And Blood Meridian really, really struck me. I still think of a scene in that he wrote about the Comanche horses, the hundreds and hundreds of horses coming with the handprints on the flanks. Oh, yeah.
You
know, and one of the most beautiful descriptions in any book I've ever read. And then I grew up loving Mark Twain, you know, and, you know, his when he wrote about the West, it was great, you know, a whole different smoke, you know, but so I think those two guys.
If you had to pick, and this would be tough, but pick your favorite spot in the West, and don't give away any secrets, but is there a specific, could be a creek. I know there is a stretch of creek that's very special.
Yeah, that's where my ashes are going, you know.
Oh, really?
And probably a little bit in that bay and river mouth in Mexico. But yeah, there's a creek, you know, it's the one that Bobby Reedy put me on, you know, when I was going to go down to the gold medal trout waters at the Forks of the Gunnison, and he said, "Man, that'll be full of fuckwits from Aspen. Go high." And he told me where to go. And it's a stretch of mountain creek that there's hardly anyone ever there. I'm usually, if I go in the evening, I'm the only one. And the road, as I wade upstream, the road climbs away from the creek, and so you get into a canyon where you're away from the road. It's just a little dirt road. No one's on it anyway. So you're really alone, and the wind starts to stir. It's upstream in the beginning, and then as night falls, it starts to flow and cools. It starts to come down against your cast, and that's a pain. And sometimes I'll just hear a knock and look up. And it's in a wooded canyon, and I'll look up, and there'll be a deer crossing the creek, and you stop in the middle of the creek and just look at me, watch me fish. It's like, holy cow, what could be better than this on the planet?
Not much.
I love it.
Kind of final question. This is a tough one. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received? And it could be related to writing, could be related to just life.
I was finished the Dog Stars. And I thought, sort of like seventh day, this is good. I love this book. And if other people love it too, it may create a little bit of a clamor. And I've heard about second novel syndrome and sophomore effort and all. I did not want that pressure. So I thought, okay, my editor says it'll be out in like 9 months. So I got 9 months. I better start the next one, So no pressure. So I started The Painter. And I got into it a few weeks, and I started to think about it. I had said, I'd say, don't think, just listen. Well, I started to think about The Painter. I was thinking, okay, he kills this guy, he's beating a horse, and should the guy have a brother who's bent on vengeance? And, I called my editor, Jenny, and she said, yeah, of course you should have a brother. So I wrote the brother, and then I started thinking, well, he's got this commission to paint, these portraits in Santa Fe. When should he go? And should the brother follow him, bent on vengeance? And then I was thinking, I'm thinking about it. This can't be good. I didn't think about the last one, and it worked out. So I was in Paonia, in the little coffee shop where actually Jim Stegner, my character, meets his model. Yeah. And it's a real coffee shop. And it's about as big as the little living room we're sitting in now.
I think I've been in that place.
Yeah. You have. I'm sure you have. It's the only really place to get a latte.
I think I have, yeah.
And there's one table in the middle. You're going to talk to anyone who's in there. Mm-hmm. Guess who was in there? Paolo Bacigalupi, the great science fiction writer.
Oh, really?
And he lives in Paonia. And I, waved to him on the street and stuff. But I'd never really talked to him. And so we started talking about writing the way writers do. And I started telling him about this kind of creative burden I was under. And he picked up his coffee cup, and he's a lot younger than me, but he said, "Sit down, son. I want to tell you a story." He said, "I wrote one short story I completely channeled." And by the way, any writers coming up listening to this, it's not really channeling. You're not taking dictation from God. If anyone ever tells you that, that's bullshit. Yeah. What it is you're a basketball player that's taken 1 million shots. You've done 1 million drives. You've trained and trained and trained, and you get in a flow. And, that training allows you to be in that sort of flow. And you're making all those decisions unconsciously that you've learned to make, So anyway, he said, Fugues Day, I woke up, the story was done, I sent it in, and it won a big award, and I love it. Second story, I plotted every second. I engineered the characters to interact a certain way in every scene, total control through the whole thing. I knew the ending. I sent it in, it won a big award, and I love it. And now when I hold them both up, I look at them and I love them both, and I can't tell the difference. And he leaned forward and he said, "Your job is just to make sure it doesn't suck." And the whole creative burden just lifted off. I thought, well, that's something I could probably handle. And what he was saying was so marvelous. He was saying like two things. He was saying, one, you've written 100 stories. Yeah. You've got your craft. Rely on your craft. In revision, you can throw out the slow stuff or tighten up the slow stuff, throw out the bad stuff, add where you need to, move stuff around. No big deal. Just make sure it's not terrible. The second thing he was saying was, which is so wonderful, is every story can have a different method. Mm-hmm. Don't sweat it. Some stories you can plot, some stories you can bootstrap it. Just let it rip. And it was great. And I've carried that advice with me, and I'm very grateful for it.
That's great advice. That's a great way to wrap it up. Thank you very much for your time. This is awesome.
It's been a great pleasure, and it's great to meet you.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor. Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, and or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.